Imagine a brilliant physicist spoken of in the same breath as Galileo and Newton, stepping onto a ship one evening and vanishing without a trace. This is exactly what happened in 1938 when Ettore Majorana, a prodigious Italian scientist, disappeared under eerie circumstances. But this isn't your usual missing person case, and it turns out that there's very good evidence to suggest he actually lived his life out half a world away. Ettore Majorana was born in Catania, Sicily, on August 5, 1906, into a well-off family of intellectuals. From a young age, he showed exceptional, and perhaps even prodigious, mathematical talent. He initially pursued engineering at university, likely due to his father's influence, but ultimately switched to physics, where he fell into the circle of legendary physicist Enrico Fermi. Majorana quickly stood out even among these bright minds, astonishing peers and mentors with elegant solutions to tough problems. His contributions to theoretical physics were profound, though he had little interest in publishing papers. He tackled quantum theory and subatomic particles, and he even anticipated the existence of the neutron before it was officially discovered. Majorana's modesty and reluctance to publish meant he only authored 9 scientific papers in his life, but those few works left an enduring legacy. Despite, or perhaps because of, his brilliance, Majorana became increasingly reclusive and troubled in the mid-1930s. After a fruitful period working with renowned physicists like Werner Heisenberg in Germany and Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, Majorana returned to Italy with a growing sense of isolation. He saw his own work as trivial and was often reluctant to share his breakthroughs. Friends and colleagues noted that he withdrew from social life. For several years, he largely shut himself away, avoiding even close family and friends. In late 1937, however, he took a post as a full professor of theoretical physics at the University of Naples, an extraordinary appointment for a 31-year-old. This role brought him out of isolation briefly, as he began teaching in early 1938. Yet, those around him could see he was not at ease. Majorana was devoutly Catholic and prone to what have been called mystical crises, and he seemed burdened by internal conflicts. These personal struggles, which may be viewed as bouts of acute mental illness, foreshadowed the dramatic steps he would soon take. In late March 1938, Majorana's inner turmoil came to a head. Without warning, he withdrew all the money from his bank account and even collected back pay he had never bothered to pick up, signs that he was putting his affairs in order. On March 25, 1938, Majorana left Naples, likely aboard the steamer Città di Palermo, bound for Sicily. Before departing, he penned a cryptic letter to his colleague and friend Antonio Carelli, the director of the Naples Physics Institute. In this note, Majorana stated he had made an unavoidable decision and apologized for the trouble his sudden disappearance would cause. He asked Carelli to remember him kindly to colleagues and students, hinting that by the time the letter was read, he might already be gone. This sounded ominously like a farewell. Yet the very same evening, Majorana sent a follow-up telegram from Palermo in Sicily that baffled everyone. It said that the sea had quote-unquote rejected him and that he'd be heading back tomorrow. This dramatic phrase suggested that Majorana had a serious change of heart. Some interpret it to mean he might have tried eliminating himself by jumping into the sea during the voyage, but then survived or reconsidered. True to his word, he appeared to purchase a return ticket and may have boarded a ship back to Naples on March 26th. In fact, there were unconfirmed reports that colleagues saw him on the Naples-bound boat or back in Naples shortly thereafter. However, after that point, Ettore Majorana was never seen again in the official record. When he failed to reappear, his family and friends panicked. Majorana's disappearance was reported to the authorities, and an intensive search was launched both in Sicily and on the Italian mainland. The news that such a famed physicist had vanished triggered a massive response. Majorana's family, colleagues, and the Italian police undertook a frantic search, scouring passenger lists, ports, and coastlines for any trace of him. Even Majorana's mentor, Enrico Fermi, intervened at the highest levels. Fermi, who deeply appreciated Majorana's unique genius, reportedly told his wife that if Ettore had decided to disappear, he was clever enough that no one would ever find him. Notably, this statement has later been interpreted as indicating that Fermi may have known more than he was letting on, as you'll see shortly. Despite this grim acknowledgement of Majorana's cunning, Fermi was determined to try. He even appealed to Italy's leader Benito Mussolini to dedicate government resources to finding the missing scientist. Convincing Mussolini that this was a matter of national security, an extensive manhunt ensued. Ships and hospitals were checked, and the Italian Navy combed the sea routes, but nothing concrete emerged. The only clues left behind were Majorana's haunting letters. In his hotel room in Naples, a short note addressed to his family was found. It told them not to mourn him in traditional black clothing, perhaps signifying that he had simply disappeared and wasn't actually deceased. Over the ensuing decades, numerous theories emerged to explain what might have happened to the vanishing genius. One popular idea is that Majorana foresaw the destructive power of nuclear physics and chose to disappear to avoid any role in it. While Majorana's colleagues like Fermi did go on to work on the Manhattan Project, there's no direct evidence that Majorana himself voiced such fears before he vanished. Still, the timing and his brilliance make this theory enticing, a genius fleeing the future he predicted. Over the years, there were numerous reported sightings of Majorana in places like Argentina and Venezuela. Some hypothesized that he secretly fled Italy, possibly motivated by guilt or a desire to live anonymously, far from the looming conflict in Europe. In fact, in the 1950s, an Italian television claimed to have tracked him down to Venezuela, where he was living a simple life under an assumed identity. The only problem with this theory, though, is that they decided to continue to let him live his life of quiet anonymity. Some have speculated that the producers could have simply made up this narrative for a television series, given the popularity of the case in Italy. That said, of course, it's also possible that they did track him down, and that they chose to respect his wishes. I'll come back to this theory in a moment, though, since there was a recent explosive development relating to that Italian documentary. Others, of course, believe that Majorana may have simply ended his own life, though this theory has been hotly contested. Majorana's devout Catholic faith and the absence of a body, as well as the note telling his family not to mourn in black, are all factors against this. Further, there's also the fact that he appears to have rejected the idea of ending himself when he came back from Sicily. A theory favored by Majorana's own family was that he suffered a spiritual or existential crisis and retreated to a monastery in Italy. Given his religious devotion, they speculated he might have chosen a life of seclusion and contemplation over fame. Indeed, his priest and confessor hinted that Ettore had experienced deep mystical episodes and may have had other plans for his life. Naturally, though, this priest couldn't come out and say what happened even if he knew what did, so long as the context of what was said was during confession. This theory portrays Majorana's disappearance almost as a deliberate act of spiritual exile, mirroring the idea of the more physical self-exile from Italy. Like with Fermi, the fact that his confessor gave this cryptic statement has been viewed as somewhat unusual in light of subsequent happenings. There were even darker speculations that Majorana might have been kidnapped or killed because of the sensitive knowledge he possessed. Some wondered if agents of a foreign power, or even shadowy elements within Italy, abducted him to prevent his intellect from aiding another country's atomic projects. Given that Majorana would have almost certainly been working on the Manhattan Project if he had followed Fermi to America, this idea has gathered a lot of steam. That said, while it may be interesting to speculate about, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest this was the case. Remarkably, the case saw a revival in the 21st century when new clues emerged. In 2011, an elderly witness came forward in Italy claiming not only to have seen Majorana alive in the late 1940s, but even to have befriended him in Buenos Aires. This prompted the Rome Attorney's Office to officially reopen the investigation 73 years after Majorana vanished. Soon, a photograph surfaced, allegedly showing Majorana, under the name Mr. Beanie, living in Valencia in Venezuela in 1955. Forensic analysts compared this photo with images of Majorana and found a number of striking similarities in facial features. Also, if you're one of those people who just listens, this may be a good time to take a look and see if you can see the resemblance between the two men. Adding to the intrigue, reports emerged of a postcard written by Majorana's uncle that was purportedly found among the belongings of this mysterious individual. These pieces of evidence strongly suggested that Majorana had survived and lived in South America under an assumed identity. Following these developments, Italian authorities announced an official conclusion. In February 2015, the Rome Attorney's Office declared that he likely lived abroad in Venezuela, at least from 1955 to 1959. No criminal act was identified. In other words, the investigation found that Majorana likely chose to remove himself from his former life. With that statement, the decades-old case was closed from a legal standpoint. It's an astonishing outcome. After so many years of uncertainty, the authorities essentially concluded that the genius physicist quietly lived out his life in obscurity. The official verdict has not put an end to the fascination with Majorana's story. Even if he did live incognito in Venezuela, many unanswered questions remain. Why would a scientist of Majorana's caliber abandon a promising career and family to live in hiding? Was he truly driven by a moral objection to nuclear weapons, overwhelming anxiety, or something else we may never understand? It's also unknown what ultimately became of him after 1959. If he lived longer, he appears to have kept an exceedingly low profile. In 2025, nearly 87 years after he vanished, an Italian court finally declared Ettore Majorana presumed dead, providing legal closure to his status. For more than 30 years after 1930, a lone woman would slip into a quiet Greenwich Village bar every August 6th and order 2 cocktails. She would raise one glass in a silent toast to her absent companion, then depart, leaving the second drink untouched. The woman was Stella Crater, and the toast was for her missing husband, Judge Joseph Force Crater, who vanished on a warm summer night in 1930 and never returned. Crater's disappearance shocked the nation and became an instant media sensation. To this day, what happened to Judge Crater remains one of America's most notorious unsolved mysteries, a true tale of a man who stepped into a taxi and was never seen again. Joseph Force Crater was no ordinary missing person. He was a prominent New York judge and attorney at the height of a successful career. Born in 1889 to Irish immigrant parents in Pennsylvania, Crater climbed the ranks of the legal world through talent and political savvy. He practiced law in Manhattan and became deeply involved with Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic political machine that dominated New York City politics. Through his work with Tammany leader Martin Healy, Crater earned lucrative court appointments and cultivated influential connections. In one notable case in 1929, he handled a hotel foreclosure that led to a spectacular profit for a well-connected buyer, raising eyebrows about insider deal-making in Crater's circle. By 1930, Crater's loyalty and networking paid off. Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him to fill a vacancy on the New York State Supreme Court, a prestigious judgeship, in April of that year. At just 41 years old, Crater was considered very young for the position and was seen as a rising star in New York's judiciary, backed by both political patronage and genuine ability. Justice Crater was even seen as someone who may eventually make it onto the Supreme Court one day. Despite his marriage to Stella, Judge Crater had a reputation as a man about town, and he had no problem doing a little bit of pipe-fitting work on the side. Tall, well-dressed, and sociable, he loved the nightlife of jazz-age New York. Friends nicknamed him Good Time Joe for his penchant for piano playing, dancing, and mingling with showgirls and Broadway speakeasies. He moved in both high society and more unsavory circles, rubbing elbows with politicians, business magnates, and the occasional gangster. In the summer of 1930, only months after Crater joined the state Supreme Court, trouble was brewing in New York's halls of power. The Manhattan District Attorney had launched a corruption inquiry into Tammany Hall's practice of selling judgeships to the highest bidder. Judge Crater appeared unperturbed at first, vacationing with Stella at their lakeside summer home in Maine. But on August 3, 1930, Crater received an urgent phone call and abruptly announced to his wife that he had to return to the city to straighten things out. He promised to be back in Maine in time for Stella's birthday on August 9th. In reality, instead of immediately tending to any official business, Crater detoured to the beach resort of Atlantic City with a young showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz, in tow. And yeah, since I can't resist a good bit of humor, it appears that the good judge was straightening certain things out, at the very least. This secret jaunt with a chorus girl would only come to light later, hinting that Crater had personal matters, or pleasures, occupying his time even as political storms gathered. Judge Crater arrived back in Manhattan on August 6, 1930, the last day he was seen alive. That morning, he went into his chambers at the courthouse and spent a couple of hours methodically sorting through his files, even reportedly destroying some documents. He had his assistant cash 2 checks for him and withdrew the modern equivalent of almost $100,000. Crater and the assistant then brought 2 locked briefcases from his office to his apartment, after which the judge dismissed his aide for the day. These actions later struck investigators as suspicious, as if Crater were tying up loose ends or stashing something important. That evening, Judge Crater continued his routine of enjoying the town. He purchased a ticket for a new Broadway comedy at the Belasco Theater, and then headed to dinner at Billy Hass's Chop House on West 45th Street. His dining companions were William Klein, a fellow lawyer and friend, and the ever-present Sally Lou Ritz, the showgirl from his Atlantic City trip. The trio ate, drank, and laughed together, with Crater reportedly in fine spirits. Sometime around 9 that evening, as the group stood outside the restaurant, Crater hailed a taxicab passing by. No one would ever definitively see Judge Joseph Crater again. At first, no alarm was raised, and when Crater failed to return to Maine for Stella's birthday, she grew annoyed, but assumed her husband's work had delayed him. Crater's colleagues in New York also thought little of his absence, believing he was still vacationing in Maine. Only after a week passed with no word did Stella begin making anxious phone calls to friends in the city, searching for any sign of him. On August 25th, the New York courts reopened for a new term and were notably 1 judge short. Crater's fellow justices, realizing he was neither in Maine nor at work, initiated quiet inquiries into his whereabouts. When these discreet efforts turned up nothing, the police were finally notified on September 3, 1930. The story of the missing judge hit the front pages the next day, and a frenzy of speculation ensued. A massive investigation swung into motion. Detectives discovered that Crater's personal safe deposit box had been mysteriously emptied, and those 2 briefcases he'd taken home had vanished without a trace. These leads went nowhere, however, as tips and alleged sightings of the missing judge flooded in from all over. In October 1930, a grand jury was impaneled to examine the case in exhaustive detail. 95 witnesses were called and nearly 1,000 pages of testimony collected. The inquiry delved into Crater's bank records, phone calls, and relationships, trying to piece together a puzzle with precious few pieces. Throughout, Stella Crater remained in Maine, refusing to face what she considered accusatory treatment by authorities and scandal-hungry newspapers. In January 1931, after months of hearings, the grand jury concluded its investigation with a frustrating shrug. In short, they couldn't say if he was alive or dead, let alone what caused his disappearance. In a bizarre twist, just days after the grand jury disbanded, Stella Crater made a discovery that only deepened the mystery. While cleaning out her husband's dresser back in their New York apartment, she found a secret compartment containing 4 envelopes. Inside were stacks of stocks and bonds, checks, life insurance papers, and Crater's will, all documents that had been missed in prior police searches. There was also a handwritten note from Crater himself. In it, the judge had listed various debts owed to him and included a brief, poignant message to Stella that hinted at his despair and ended with a loving goodbye. The cache suggested that Crater might have anticipated some trouble, but it yielded no concrete clues as to his fate. He was officially declared dead in absentia in 1939, allowing Stella to collect life insurance. Decades later, in 1979, the NYPD finally closed the case without resolution. From the moment the story broke in 1930, the disappearance of Judge Crater generated a whirlwind of theories. Over the years, professional investigators and amateur sleuths alike have proposed many possible explanations, each as compelling as it is unprovable. The tale has all the ingredients of a great mystery, including political intrigue, gangsters, showgirls, and a man who seemingly evaporated into thin air. One early theory was that Crater chose to vanish of his own accord. It seemed implausible that a man of his stature would abandon his career and wife without a word. Yet some pointed to the large sum of cash he withdrew and the documents he took as signs of a planned getaway. In the years after 1930, reported Crater sightings cropped up across the country and even overseas, fueling the idea that he might still be alive under an assumed identity. Tipsters claimed to have seen a man resembling Crater in far-flung locales ranging from rural Canada to the South Pacific. Carnival workers, gold prospectors, and even a man in the French Foreign Legion were rumored to be the missing judge in disguise. Another theory suggested Crater met with an accidental death that was then covered up. For example, lurid rumors hinted he might have suffered a heart attack in the company of a lady of the night, and any witnesses disposed of the body rather than face scandal. After all, Crater was known for enjoying good times, so this didn't seem too unlikely. Given Judge Crater's ties to Tammany Hall and the timing of his disappearance, many have suspected that political corruption was at the heart of this mystery. Crater had been a cog in Tammany's powerful machine, and he literally owed his judgeship to their influence. He likely knew about the murky transactions involved in buying and selling public offices. In mid-1930, a state investigation was zeroing in on Tammany's judicial corruption, and Crater's mentor, Martin Healy, was under scrutiny. The theory goes that Crater might have been ready to talk, or at least that others feared he would talk. Eliminating the judge could have been a convenient way for higher-ups to protect themselves. Some even whispered of a connection to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then New York's governor and had presidential ambitions. The logic being that if a scandal about selling judgeships blew up, it could tarnish Roosevelt on the national stage. Notably, years later, foes of Roosevelt would insinuate that FDR's allies knew more about Crater's fate, darkly suggesting that he knew where the body was. While there's no proof of any connection to Tammany Hall, this powerful and corrupt organization had benefited from extrajudicial usage of force in the past. Closely intertwined with the political angle is the possibility that organized crime figures played a role. New York's underworld and its political world were often two sides of the same coin in that era. Judge Crater was known to enjoy late nights in the city's clubs and had rubbed shoulders with some infamous characters. He was friendly with Irish gangster Jack Diamond and distraught over the 1928 slaying of his acquaintance Arnold Rothstein. Such connections have long fed the theory that Crater knew too much about the criminal underbelly of the city. Perhaps he stumbled into information that made him a liability, or perhaps someone in the mob felt the judge hadn't delivered on a promise. Another set of theories suggests that he was blackmailed by someone he was having an affair with, or a woman of whom he was a regular client. Under this theory, he had routinely been paying off large amounts of hush money to this woman in exchange for her silence. However, it's speculated that the last payment was insufficient, and she had a local gangster take him out. Personally, I don't find this narrative to be incredibly compelling, since if it's true, she permanently cut off the source of her extortion. After all, he was a politically well-connected judge, and he would have further money or influence to extort in the future. Simply put, I think this is likely just a lurid theory that was drummed up to sell newspapers back in the day. For decades, the mystery of Judge Crater remained stubbornly unsolved until a stunning potential clue emerged 75 years later. In August 2005, New York authorities announced they had obtained new evidence in the cold case. A handwritten letter left by a 91-year-old widow named Stella Ferrucci Good. This woman had been the wife of a detective, and in a letter opened after she had perished, she revealed an explosive story her husband had allegedly told her. According to Ferrucci Good's letter, Judge Crater had indeed been slain back in 1930, not by mobsters or jilted lovers, but by two men, one of them who wore a badge. The letter named a New York City police officer, Charles Burns, and his brother Frank, who happened to be a cab driver. On the night of August 6, 1930, the story went, the Burns brothers somehow intercepted Crater. They eliminated the judge, and then buried his body under the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. Incredibly, the letter also tied Charles Burns to other violence of the era. Investigators in 2005 were initially intrigued, and they noted the area mentioned. West 8th Street on Coney Island, now the site of the New York Aquarium, had indeed been excavated during construction in the 1950s. And actually, let me just jump in here for a second, since as I was doing the editing on this video, I realized something. Coney Island isn't an actual island anymore, and hasn't been one for well over a century when an engineering project connected it to Brooklyn. Anyway, if a skeleton had been found then, it was never reported. Police records showed no such discovery, and a preliminary check of municipal works didn't turn up any bones either. This late-breaking confession left more questions than answers. No one could say if the detective's tale was true, or if it was just a fanciful story that he told to his wife. Since Stella had already passed away by the time the letter was opened, there was no opportunity to question her about the contents of the letter. Further yet, the evidence is hearsay from a person who isn't even alive, giving evidence about a supposed conversation with another person who also isn't alive. This is, of course, extremely problematic, as aside from confirming that her husband was indeed a police officer, nothing else could be known for certain. Stella herself could have simply been an avid follower of the case with a bit of a sick sense of humor, looking to insert herself into the investigation from beyond the grave. And if that was her intent, well, then she definitely succeeded. At any rate, no physical evidence was recovered to substantiate the claim, and skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. In the years following Crater's disappearance, his name became a punchline and a piece of Americana, even as his wife quietly kept her vow to never forget him. The very phrase, "to pull a crater," entered the lexicon as slang for vanishing without a trace. And from my research, it looks as though this phrase would have essentially been used in the same way we use the phrase ghosting today. Whatever the case, Justice Crater's disappearance likely remains such a popular unsolved mystery because there are so many possibilities as to what happened. Further, some of these possibilities credibly intersect with big names in both New York history and American history. Amelia Earhart was more than a pioneering aviator. She was an American icon. Born in Kansas in 1897 with an adventurous spirit, she took to the skies in her 20s and quickly broke barriers in the male-dominated field of aviation. In 1932, Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that made headlines worldwide. She went on to set numerous records, including a solo flight from Hawaii to California, and her charisma and courage made her an international celebrity. Using her fame to champion women's opportunities in aviation, Earhart became a symbol of bravery and new possibilities for a generation of young women. By 1937, Earhart had set her sights on her most ambitious journey yet, a flight around the world at the equator. She and navigator Fred Noonan planned to circumnavigate the globe in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra, making stops to refuel along the way. After nearly completing the arduous trek from Miami through South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, they reached Lae in New Guinea. On July 2nd, 1937, they departed Lae for a tiny speck of land in the Pacific, Howland Island, which was to be their next refueling stop. A U.S. Coast Guard ship, the Ithaca, waited off Howland to guide them in by radio. But as Earhart's plane neared the area, she radioed that she was low on fuel and couldn't find Howland. The Ithaca could hear her transmissions, but she couldn't hear their replies. Earhart's last known message described a navigational line she was following, followed by silence. An extensive search by the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, the largest of its kind at the time, scoured the ocean around Howland Island and beyond for weeks. However, they found no trace of the plane or its crew. With nothing to show for their efforts, officials concluded that the aircraft had simply run out of fuel and crashed at sea. This crash and sink explanation was accepted as the likely end of her journey. Yet the lack of concrete evidence left room for doubt, and over the years, a number of alternative theories emerged to fill that void. What follows are the leading theories about what might have happened on that fateful day in 1937. The most straightforward theory is that Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra ran out of fuel near Howland Island and fell into the Pacific Ocean. In this scenario, Earhart and Noonan, unable to spot their tiny target island, would have been forced down into open water once their fuel was exhausted. A water landing in rough seas could have torn the plane apart or sent it straight to the ocean floor. Given the vast expanse of the Pacific and its strong currents, it's not surprising that searchers in 1937 found no trace of debris. Earhart's final radio calls support this idea. She never mentioned seeing land, and her last reported navigation line would have carried the plane far past Howland into empty ocean. Many historians have long considered the crash at sea narrative the most plausible explanation. Another theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan might have landed safely on an uninhabited coral atoll, then called Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. According to this theory, the pair survived there for some time as castaways. The idea is that when they couldn't find Howland, Earhart turned the plane southeast along the line she had mentioned in her last transmission, hoping to find land. Gardner Island lies about 350 miles in that direction. In 1937 it was deserted, but it offered a long flat reef at low tide that could have been used as an emergency runway. It's conceivable that Earhart spotted this island, brought the plane down on the reef, and sent out distress radio calls until the rising tide swept the plane into the sea. In fact, in the days after the disappearance, some radio stations picked up faint distress signals that were never fully explained. In 1940, a British officer discovered skeletal remains on the island, along with a portion of a shoe and some navigational equipment. At the time, investigators concluded the bones were from a man who didn't meet the description of Noonan, and were obviously not from Earhart, and the remains were unfortunately lost. However, modern analysis of the original bone measurements suggests they could have belonged to a woman of European descent about Earhart's height. Unfortunately, this was based upon a reanalysis of the measurements from 1940, not a re-examination of the bones themselves as they were lost. Had the bones been maintained, it may have been possible to tie them to Earhart's family through forensic genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, unless these lost remains are recovered, we simply don't have this luxury. A very different hypothesis is that Earhart's final landing wasn't on a friendly island at all, but in territory controlled by Japan, leading to her capture. In 1937, Japan administered the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, not far north of Earhart's intended route. Some believe that Earhart and Noonan, unable to find Howland, might have drifted off course and ended up in the Marshalls. According to this theory, the Japanese military would have taken them into custody, possibly suspecting them of espionage, given rising pre-war tensions. Indeed, over the years, a few islanders and U.S. servicemen claimed they had seen or heard of two American flyers held by the Japanese before World War II. One persistent rumor placed Earhart on Saipan as a prisoner. However, no credible documentation has ever surfaced to support these claims. In fact, a blurry photograph emerged in 2017 that supposedly showed Earhart and Noonan in Japanese custody. A History Channel show called Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence, claimed that the photograph was taken in 1937. However, after the claim was made, a Japanese blogger found that the photograph actually came from a book published in 1935, 2 years prior to the disappearance of Earhart and Noonan. Whatever the case, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan remains one of the most famous and haunting mysterious disappearances in history. In late 1809, as the Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe, a 25-year-old British diplomat named Benjamin Bathurst set out on a tense journey home. Bathurst was the well-connected son of a bishop and already a seasoned envoy despite his age. He had just left Vienna, where he'd tried in vain to draw Austria into an alliance against Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, with Austria defeated, Bathurst feared French spies were on his trail. Disguised as a humble merchant and traveling under a false name, he planned to slip north through Prussia to the port of Hamburg and sail back to England. It was a risky route. The roads were crawling with bandits and stray soldiers, and every town posed new dangers for a lone British envoy behind enemy lines. On the evening of November 25, 1809, Bathurst's carriage halted at the Prussian town of Perleberg for a brief rest. He and his courier, a man named Herr Kraus, had dinner at the White Swan Inn, while fresh horses were being readied for the next leg of their trip. Bathurst was cautious. He had decided to depart under cover of darkness, hoping the night would cloak his passage. Ever on edge, he peered into the gloom and was wary of every flicker of shadow around the inn yard. At around 9 p.m., with the carriage waiting in the lamplit courtyard, Bathurst donned his heavy fur coat and stepped outside. Witnesses later recalled seeing him walk around to the front of his horses, perhaps to inspect the team or speak to the carriage driver. In that fleeting moment, the young diplomat vanished. When Kraus emerged moments later, there was no sign of Bathurst anywhere. One moment Bathurst was there beside the horses, the next he had melted into the shadows without a sound. Local authorities were notified, but in the chaos of Napoleonic-era Prussia, a missing traveler raised little alarm at first. However, when the Prussians, who were officially neutral at this point, learned that the man wasn't a merchant, but a British diplomat, this caught the attention of the local authorities. By the next day, Captain Friedrich von Klitzing had soldiers dragging the nearby river and combing Perleberg for any trace of the Englishman. Their search soon turned up disturbing clues. Bathurst's fur-lined cloak was found hidden in a stable behind a house owned by an inn worker. 2 weeks later, a pair of his trousers surfaced in the woods outside town. Oddly, the pants had strange holes in them and contained papers including a letter to Bathurst's wife, but there were no bloodstains. It looked like someone had fired shots through the clothing after removing it, perhaps to fake a violent ambush. Suspicion ended up falling on a member of the inn's staff, August Schmidt. He was caught with the missing coat and promptly arrested, but no body or weapon was found, and he was eventually released without charges. And I just have to mention it here, but this expensive coat was found in an outhouse owned by the Schmidt family. So yeah, sometimes the comedy just writes itself, doesn't it? Desperate for answers, Bathurst's wife, Phillida, traveled to Prussia and even secured an audience with Napoleon Bonaparte to ask if he knew of her husband's fate. Napoleon solemnly denied any French involvement, and indeed no hard evidence ever tied French agents to the disappearance. The Prussian king and British government posted hefty rewards for information, yet every lead turned cold. As the winter of 1809 wore on, Benjamin Bathurst had effectively vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions. In the absence of a definitive answer, numerous theories emerged to explain his disappearance. The simplest and most mundane explanation is that Bathurst was robbed and slain by opportunists. He was traveling with conspicuous wealth, a fine coat, jewelry, money, through an area that had been impoverished by war. It's easy to imagine him stepping away from the inn's lights and being ambushed in the darkness by thieves. The suspicious conduct of the inn's employees and the fact that the wealth seems to have been distributed amongst them supports this idea. The fact that he wasn't openly traveling as a diplomat also lends some additional credibility to the theory. I imagine the inn staff would have seen a wealthy merchant as much easier pickings than an influential and well-connected British diplomat on official business on the continent. But guys, I'm going to dox myself a bit here. I'm not a Prussian waiter at an inn circa the Napoleonic era, so this is just speculation on my part. I know some of you are probably shocked right now, but yeah, I just got to speak my truth. Years later, in 1852, workers demolishing a nearby building discovered a human skeleton buried under a threshold, the skull split by a heavy blow. Many believed that Bathurst had finally been found, though at the time there was no way to prove this was him, and the evidence wasn't preserved. At the time, public opinion favored a more conspiratorial view, that Bathurst was the victim of an attack by French agents. As a British envoy working against Napoleon, he could have been targeted. British newspapers loudly accused Napoleon's spies of abducting Bathurst, suggesting he'd been seized and quietly eliminated on official orders. The French government angrily refuted these charges, instead insinuating that Bathurst had gone insane. The French government further accused the British diplomatic service of routinely employing people who are in poor mental health. They even released an official statement saying that the British diplomatic service is well known worldwide for employing madmen, which I suppose passed for 19th century French banter. Despite extensive diplomatic inquiries, no proof ever emerged that France captured or in any other way interfered with Bathurst. As I mentioned earlier, Napoleon personally guaranteed to Bathurst's wife that Bathurst hadn't been harmed by French agents. Given the context at the time, this didn't satisfy many in Britain. However, these inquiries were raised again after Napoleon's fall, and again officials denied all involvement in the disappearance. Further, historians find it highly unlikely that Napoleon would have ordered a diplomat to be abducted and slain. The reasoning for this is grounded in practicality. All sides in any conflict know that diplomats are necessary, and neither side wishes to have their people treated in such a way. Another theory suggests that Bathurst took the opportunity to leave his life behind and live on the continent. Under intense stress and fearing for his life, it's possible he suffered a mental breakdown or decided to desert his mission. Friends noted that in his final days, he was extremely anxious, even paranoid, about being followed. Indeed, the letter Bathurst left for his wife, recovered from his abandoned trousers, was reportedly disjointed and desperate, as if he felt surrounded by enemies. Perhaps he lost his nerve and fled into hiding. One rumor claimed that an unidentified Englishman fitting Bathurst's description turned up in a Baltic port that winter, refusing to give his name, and boarded a ship for Sweden. According to this unverified narrative, the vessel sank in a storm. Despite the intense stress he was under, most experts agree that there's simply no indication that he chose to willingly run off. Notably, in modern times, the story of Benjamin Bathurst has found new life, with an infusion of paranormal influence. Given that he disappeared under such bizarre circumstances, some have speculated that he may have slipped through time. That said, ultimately, there's no indication that such an event ever occurred. Over 2 centuries later, the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst remains an enduring mystery. The most likely conclusion, that he was slain by local robbers in Prussia, is also the least sensational, but it fits best with the sparse facts we have. Yet without definitive proof or witnesses, absolute certainty has eluded all investigations. No culprit was ever identified, and no grave was ever officially confirmed. The greatest mystery in modern British history doesn't involve complex espionage or an elaborate heist. Instead, it began with a British lord, a heavy lead pipe, and Sandra Rivet, an unfortunate nanny caught up in a dispute which she had no part in. Imagine the scene. A man who was a peer of the realm, vanishing overnight from the heart of London, leaving behind an act of horrifying evil. This was the fate of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, better known to the world and to history as Lord Lucan. He was a dashing, charismatic aristocrat, a fixture of high society, so effortlessly suave, he was reportedly considered for the role of James Bond. Yet, on the night of November 7th, 1974, that gilded image dissolved into a terrifying reality. Lucan's high social standing and the brutality of the crime instantly guaranteed the scandal's status as a global phenomenon. What followed was an intense and unsuccessful manhunt, followed by decades of rampant speculation. The mystery of Lord Lucan endures not because the facts are scarce, but because the truth remains trapped between the evidence and the tantalizing possibility of a high society conspiracy. To understand the disappearance, we must first look at the man behind it all. Richard John Bingham, who held the title of Lord Lucan, had a typical aristocratic upbringing, attending Eton College and serving briefly with the legendary Coldstream Guards. Following his military service, he became a banker in London. However, he quickly gave up this career to dedicate himself fully to high-stakes gambling. He became an early and persistent member of the exclusive group of wealthy gamblers at the Claremont Club, where his expensive tastes were well known. Despite adopting the nickname Lucky Lucan, his luck was decidedly finite, and the name became ironic. His losses were crushing, and he ran up immense gambling debts, sometimes losing amounts as high as £10,000, forcing his uncle to intervene to cover his creditors. While he continued to live the high life in both Britain and the United States for a few years, the reality of his financial insolvency eventually caught up with him. His personal life was similarly troubled. Lucan's marriage to Veronica Duncan, which began in 1963, soon became characterized as grimly unhappy. Veronica struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and postnatal depression, following the births of their 3 children. By late 1972, the relationship had collapsed, and Lucan moved out of the family home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Keep that address in mind, because it's going to come up again. This separation sparked an intensely bitter and public custody battle over their children. The subsequent court ruling in 1974 proved devastating to the Earl. Despite doctors testifying that Lady Lucan was suffering from depression, the judge ultimately granted her full custody, restricting Lucan to visitation every other weekend. This total loss of control over his family, coupled with immense financial strain from his debts and the legal obligation to support his estranged family, sent him spiraling. He entered into a state of furious obsession, and slowly but surely he became a dangerous stalker. He began to spy on his wife and record their telephone conversations, fixated solely on regaining custody. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this disturbingly obsessive behavior manifested itself into a very dark plot. Lucan had convinced himself that his wife was the primary source of all his troubles. Friends admitted they had conversations with Lucan in which he explicitly expressed a desire to eliminate her. For him, removing Veronica from the chessboard was a horrific solution that he believed would allow him to get his children back and regain control of his house and finances. So he started planning, but like many plans, this one wouldn't work out quite how he imagined it. The carefully premeditated plan unraveled almost the moment it began, derailed by a routine of aristocratic household management. Lucan was waiting in the basement kitchen of 46 Lower Belgrave Street, expecting to find his wife alone, as he understood the family nanny, Sandra Rivet, had her usual night off. However, Rivet was unexpectedly covering for another employee in the household that evening, and was somewhere that other employee wouldn't have been. When Sandra went downstairs to the kitchen around 9 p.m., she encountered the Earl in the darkness, which totally made him change his course. Rivet was bludgeoned to death with a piece of lead piping wrapped in surgical tape. Sandra Rivet, a mother herself, was only 30 years old. When Lady Lucan went downstairs to investigate why the nanny hadn't brought up tea, she was ambushed at the top of the basement stairs. She was viciously attacked, but she managed to struggle free, possibly by pretending that she would turn over everything to him. Wounded and covered in blood, Lady Lucan fled frantically from the house and burst into the nearby Plumber's Arms pub around 10 that night. She was screaming for help, identifying her own husband as the assailant, and declaring that he had slain Sandra. The alarm was raised immediately. Lucan, recognizing that his catastrophic failure meant imminent exposure and arrest, began his brief flight. He first telephoned his mother, requesting that she collect the children from the house. He then drove a borrowed Ford Corsair to the home of his friends, Susan and Ian Maxwell Scott, in Uckfield, East Sussex, arriving around 1:15 that morning. During his time at the house, he composed several notes, which revealed his conflicted state of mind. He wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, William Shand, attempting to set up a flimsy cover story that he had surprised an intruder attacking his wife and fled in panic. Crucially, he wrote a separate note to his friend, Michael Stoop, alluding to a, quote, traumatic night of unbelievable circumstances. He asked Stoop to tell his children that Lucan had known him and cared only for them. The despairing finality of this letter suggested a man accepting his fate, overriding the attempt at a formal cover-up contained in the other letters. Unusually, the Scotts waited a highly suspicious 2 days before they contacted the authorities. Lucan's car was discovered abandoned in New Haven, 16 miles from Uckfield, 2 days after the attack. Witnesses stated the car had been parked there sometime between 4 and 8 on the morning after. The time gap between his 1:15 a.m. departure from Uckfield and the car's placement has been subject to intensive speculation. The interior of the car was found stained with type AB blood, potentially consistent with a mixture of blood from both Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet. Most damningly, investigators found the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence in the trunk. There was a piece of lead piping, identical to the weapon used in the attack, alongside a full bottle of vodka. The overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence led to an immediate warrant for the arrest of this now disgraced member of the House of Lords. Unusually, the chief detective on the case immediately publicly expressed doubt that Lord Lucan drove the vehicle to New Haven. Instead, he suggested that an accomplice may have placed the vehicle there, for reasons which I'll get to in a moment. Despite the vanishing, legal proceedings continued. In 1975, the inquest jury, convening in Lucan's absence, formally found him guilty for his killing of Sandra. This was an event of profound gravity, marking the first time a member of the House of Lords had been convicted of such a severe crime since 1760. And as a quick aside, since I can't help myself, in that case a member of the House of Lords killed his butler in cold blood. His peers in the House of Lords, who worked with him and knew him and his family, sentenced him to death in an effort to quell the uproar and preserve aristocratic power. Lucan's disappearance immediately splintered into 2 dominant opposing theories. He ended himself, or there was a high society escape. Notably, there's also a bizarre fringe theory involving a framing adding further complexity, which I'll discuss briefly as well, just for completeness' sake. The strongest evidence that he voluntarily ended his own life rests on the logic of the situation and the physical trail. Lucan was exposed, financially destroyed, and facing public condemnation. Self-destruction offered a definitive escape from justice. Further, Lucan must have been aware that any trial would threaten the ongoing privilege of the ancient aristocracy. After all, this was a clear case of a powerful and influential lord who slew an innocent common woman in cold blood. The car was abandoned in New Haven, a port town, and the final letter to Stoop possessed the unmistakable tone of a farewell. His friends publicly went on record saying they believed he had taken a motorboat into the English Channel and smashed it up on the rocks, drowning in the process. Some investigators believed this as well, though no evidence was ever found to prove such a theory. There was no body. There was no smashed-up boat. There was nothing whatsoever, only the vast void of the English Channel. The possibility of escape, however, has captivated the public imagination for decades, largely fueled by Lucan's powerful circle of friends. Lucan was a privileged member of the Claremont Set, a group of wealthy and influential figures who were suspected of facilitating his flight. Police investigations quickly ran into a frustrating wall of silence, suggesting powerful figures were actively hindering the hunt. The Claremont Set included prominent figures such as casino owner John Aspinall and businessman Sir James Goldsmith, both of whom were strongly suspected of helping Lucan evade justice. The most interesting claim for Lucan's survival emerged years later, though it must be clear that this claim is an allegation at present. A woman who had worked for Aspinall claimed in 2012 that she was instructed to book flights for Lucan's two eldest children to Africa. These flights, specifically to Kenya and Gabon, occurred between 1979 and 1981. Her instructions were to facilitate arrangements for, quote, John Bingham, also known as Lord Lucan, to see his children. However, there's a weird twist here. These were arranged as safari trips by Aspinall as a kind gesture to the children of his departed friend. She never claimed that the children themselves had actually been there to see their dad. Rather, they were there to be watched. She claimed the purpose was for Lucan to secretly observe his children during safaris without their knowledge. Lord Lucan did have a history of stalking and making secret observations, so if this is true, I guess old habits die hard. This account, if true, suggests Aspinall and Goldsmith maintained prolonged, regular contact with the fugitive for at least 7 years after the attack. But as you may have noticed, I've been saying if this is true a lot. And the fact is that there's been absolutely no evidence produced to support these allegations. This belief in Lucan's exile has fueled continuous international sightings in locations ranging from Portugal to Australia to various parts of Africa. In 2020, Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, championed the assertion that Lucan was living as an elderly Buddhist monk in a commune near Brisbane, Australia. This monk was subject to some pretty intense speculation for 2 years, and for reasons that will soon become obvious, I'm not going to show his picture here. In 2022, the man agreed to cooperate with British investigators who used DNA testing to rule him out. A final, highly controversial counter-narrative suggests that Lady Lucan herself was the killer and framed her husband. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that a small amount of Lady Lucan's blood, as well as rivets, was present at the scene. Lady Lucan claimed that this was because her psychotic husband, who was lurking in the basement, tried to bludgeon her as well, a narrative that most people accept as valid. Furthermore, a medical doctor testifying at the inquest conceded that while highly unlikely, it was possible that Lady Lucan's head injuries could have been self-inflicted. This theory holds that Lord Lucan, the guy who was stalking and harassing his wife and family, took the fall for a crime committed by Lady Lucan. Personally, I don't think this theory has the air of reality at all, and I suspect it was just whipped up to sell a book or move tabloids from newsstands. As time has gone on, I think it's clear that it's more and more likely that Lord Lucan died on November 8, 1974. The British courts eventually acknowledged this as a reality, granting the family probate over his estate in 1999. He was declared officially dead in 2016, clearing the way for his son to become the 8th Earl of Lucan.